In Alaska, gold was never just about discovery. It was about ownership. For decades, prospectors believed a simple rule: find it, claim it, work it. But that rule did not last. At a critical moment in Alaska's development, a decision quietly redefined who actually controlled the gold beneath the ground. Miners continued to dig. Towns continued to operate. Gold continued to exist. But ownership had shifted. Not through theft, not through force, through legislation. This is the story of how Alaska's gold did not disappear. It changed hands without ever moving. Before we continue, if you're interested in real stories about gold, power, and the legal decisions that reshaped entire regions, this channel focuses on documented events, not legends. Some of the most important shifts in history happen without headlines. When gold rushes began in Alaska in the late 19th century, they operated under a familiar system rooted in federal mining law. The basic principle was straightforward. Public land could be claimed by individuals who discovered valuable minerals. Once claimed and properly recorded, that land could be worked and in many cases eventually patented into private ownership. This framework encouraged risk. Prospectors travelled into extreme environments because they believed that discovery meant control. The law supported that belief. Mining claims were more than temporary rights. They were pathways to property. Entire towns grew under this assumption. Investment flowed because ownership seemed attainable. Merchants extended credit because land held value. Infrastructure slowly followed because permanence was possible. But as Alaska evolved, politically and economically, the simplicity of that system began to collide with new priorities, and the rules that once fueled expansion would not survive unchanged. By the early 20th century, Alaska was no longer viewed solely as a frontier. It was becoming strategic. Railroads were expanding. Military planners began to examine the territory more closely. Federal agencies increased oversight of land use. The old mining framework, built for rapid settlement and private claim, began to look outdated to policymakers in Washington. Under federal mining law, vast portions of public land could transition into private ownership through mineral claims and patents. In sparsely populated regions, this seemed harmless. In a territory as large and resource-rich as Alaska, it raised concern. Officials began asking new questions. Should strategic land be permanently transferred into private hands? What if mineral claims blocked future transportation routes? What if private ownership conflicted with military or environmental interests? The people challenging the system were not miners. They were legislators, administrators, and land management agencies. They saw Alaska not as a rush, but as an asset. And assets, in their view, required control. The mining laws that once encouraged exploration were built in the 19th century. They assumed abundance. They assumed distance. They assumed minimal conflict over land. But Alaska complicated those assumptions. Gold was not the only resource in the ground. Copper, coal, timber, and later oil entered the conversation. Land that appeared remote today could become essential tomorrow. Allowing permanent private control through mining patents began to look risky. If too much land passed into private ownership, federal flexibility would shrink. Infrastructure projects could be obstructed. Military sites could be limited. Future conservation efforts could be blocked. From a policy standpoint, mineral patenting began to resemble irreversible fragmentation. And fragmentation made long-term planning difficult. The system that empowered individual miners started to conflict with national interests, not because gold had lost value, but because land had gained it. The question was no longer who found the gold. The question was who should ultimately control the ground beneath it. And that shift in perspective would redefine Alaska's future. The turning point did not arrive in a single dramatic vote focused only on gold. It unfolded gradually through federal land policy shifts and then hardened into permanence. Throughout the 20th century, Congress passed a series of laws that reshaped how public land in Alaska could be claimed, used, and ultimately owned. Environmental regulation expanded. Strategic land withdrawals increased. Large areas were reclassified under federal protection. The most decisive moment came when the federal government began restricting and eventually halting the issuance of new mineral patents on public lands. Under early mining law, a valid claim could be converted into private property. This was the promise that had driven generations north. But when Congress imposed a moratorium on new mineral patents in the 1990s, a policy that remains in effect, that pathway effectively closed. Claims could still be worked. Gold could still be mined under certain conditions, but ownership of the land itself would no longer transfer. For Alaska, where vast gold-bearing areas lay within federal jurisdiction, the implication was profound. The gold could be extracted, but the ground would never belong to those who found it. The rules had changed, and the change did not confiscate gold. It redefined control. For many miners, the shift was subtle at first. Claims could still be filed. Operations could continue under regulatory oversight. Gold still had value. But something fundamental was gone: permanence. Without the ability to patent claims into private ownership, mining became a conditional activity. Permits could be revised. Regulations could tighten. Access could be re-evaluated. Investment behaviour shifted accordingly. Banks viewed operations differently when the underlying land remained federal property. Long-term development became riskier. Expansion slowed. For small independent miners, the psychological impact was just as significant as the financial one. The original social contract of frontier mining, find it and make it yours, no longer applied. They could extract wealth from the land, but they could not claim the land itself. Gold was no longer a pathway to property. It was a temporary opportunity within a system designed to retain control. From the federal perspective, this was stability. From the miner's perspective, it was limitation. The gold had not moved, but ownership had. From the federal government's perspective, the shift in mining policy achieved several long-term goals at once. First, it preserved flexibility. When land remains under federal ownership, it can be reclassified, leased, protected, or repurposed as priorities evolve. Transportation corridors can be planned without negotiating with fragmented private landholders. Military installations can expand without encountering permanent mineral patents. Conservation areas can be designated without expensive buybacks. Control remains centralized. Second, it reduced irreversible fragmentation. Under the old system, thousands of patented mining claims across Alaska could have permanently divided vast stretches of territory into private parcels. Reassembling that land later would have been costly, politically complicated, and often impossible. By keeping ownership public, the government retained leverage. Third, it aligned Alaska with broader national policy shifts. Environmental oversight strengthened. Public land became part of a larger conversation about conservation, energy, and strategic planning. Gold was no longer treated as the singular defining resource of the region. In this framework, limiting private land transfer through mining was not anti-gold. It was pro-control. Institutions benefit from predictability, and federal ownership delivered predictability at scale. The beneficiaries were not individual actors. They were systems built to think decades ahead. The losses were less visible, but deeply felt within mining communities. Independent prospectors lost leverage. Without the ability to convert claims into private property, their bargaining power declined. A patented claim could be sold, mortgaged, or developed as a long-term asset. A non-patented claim remained conditional. Small operators found it harder to secure financing. Large corporations adjusted more easily, but even they faced additional regulatory uncertainty. Over time, the culture of frontier ownership faded. The idea that discovery equaled possession had defined generations of Alaskan miners. That expectation no longer matched reality. Communities built on the assumption of eventual permanence became more cautious. Investment slowed. Expansion became incremental rather than transformative. Gold towns no longer grew with the same confidence that land would become theirs. The loss was not immediate wealth, it was influence. Miners could still extract value from the earth, but they could no longer shape the map itself. And in a territory as vast as Alaska, shaping the map had always mattered as much as shaping the economy. Over time, the shift in ownership rules did not eliminate gold mining in Alaska, but it reshaped its structure. The era of independent prospectors gradually gave way to more capital-intensive operations. Large companies, better equipped to navigate regulatory frameworks and long-term permitting, became dominant in many regions. Mining did not disappear. It consolidated. Gold production continued in Alaska through major industrial projects, often operating under federal leases or complex agreements rather than private land patents. For small operators, the landscape grew narrower. Without ownership of the land, long-term generational transfer of mining property became more complicated. Claims remained valid only as long as requirements were met and policies remained stable. The culture of find it and own it forever evolved into work it while permitted. Alaska's gold economy became more structured, more regulated, and more predictable. That predictability attracted institutional investment, but it also reduced the romantic unpredictability that once defined the territory. The gold itself had not changed. What changed was the relationship between discovery and control. Ownership was no longer the reward. Permission was. Reversing the shift back to full private patenting would require a fundamental change in federal land policy. That change has not occurred. The mineral patent moratorium remains in effect decades after its introduction. Environmental and land management frameworks have only grown more detailed. Public land control continues to be defended as a matter of national interest. From a policy standpoint, reopening mineral patenting would reintroduce fragmentation and long-term loss of federal flexibility. Administrators view the current system as balanced. Extraction is possible. Ownership remains centralized. There has been no strong political consensus to return to the old frontier model. For many lawmakers, Alaska is no longer a blank map waiting to be claimed. It is a strategic region requiring oversight. The absence of reversal is not driven by hostility toward miners. It is driven by institutional inertia and long-term planning priorities. Once control consolidates, it rarely disperses voluntarily. The decision that redefined ownership did not produce a visible crisis. It created stability, and stability is difficult to argue against. Alaska's gold never disappeared. It was never confiscated, never nationalized in a dramatic sweep, never physically taken from those who found it. The miners still dig. The companies still operate. Gold still leaves the ground, but the ground itself remains something else entirely. Public. The shift that redefined Alaska's gold was not about metal. It was about ownership of land and the long-term authority that comes with it. For generations, prospectors believed that discovery created destiny. Find the gold, and the future becomes yours. That belief shaped migration patterns, investment, and risk-taking across Alaska. When the ability to turn claims into private property ended, that belief quietly dissolved. The gold could still be worked, but it could not be permanently possessed. What replaced the frontier model was a managed system. Access became conditional. Ownership became centralized. Control became institutional. And perhaps that is the most significant transformation of all. Gold once created independent zones of power across Alaska. Now it exists within a structure designed to prevent that independence from becoming permanent. The decision did not remove gold from miners' hands. It removed permanence from their reach. So the final question is not whether Alaska still produces gold. It does. The real question is this: when discovery no longer guarantees ownership, who truly controls the wealth beneath the ground?